I first met Ethan on a quiet evening during my shift at the hospital. He was in the physical therapy ward, seated in his wheelchair by the large window overlooking the courtyard. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over his pale features. He looked lost in thought, his fingers gently tracing patterns on the armrest of his chair. There was something about him, his stillness, his intensity, that drew me in. It didn't take long for us to connect. Ethan was a patient recovering from a car accident that had left him paralyzed from the waist down. He had been an artist before the accident, and though he couldn't use his legs, he hadn't let it stop him from painting. He had adapted, painting with his mouth in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. I admired his resilience. I admired him. He was charming in a quiet, disarming way, and despite his struggles, he had a sharp wit that made me laugh during long shifts. Our relationship developed quickly, perhaps too quickly in hindsight. Ethan had a way of making me feel special, like I was the only person who truly saw him for who he was beyond the wheelchair. He would talk about his art, about how his accident had given his work new meaning, and I was captivated by his passion. He painted vivid landscapes, abstract worlds, and intricate portraits, each piece telling a story I wanted to be a part of. When he proposed to me, it was during one of those perfect moments that felt almost unreal. He had set up a small gallery in his hospital room, lining the walls with his latest paintings. In the center was a portrait of me, glowing with a radiance I didn't think I possessed. "You make me feel alive, Sophia," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want to face this life without you." My heart swelled, and without hesitation, I said yes. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was everything I had ever wanted. I vowed to stand by him, to be his partner and his caregiver, to love him through the challenges that lay ahead. For a while, life felt perfect. I would go to work, come home, and help Ethan with his daily routines. We were a team, navigating life together. But cracks began to show sooner than I expected. It started with little things, things that seemed insignificant at first. Ethan would skip his physical therapy appointments, claiming he was too tired or that the exercises weren't helping. I tried to encourage him, reminding him that progress was slow but possible. He would smile at me, that same disarming smile that had won me over, and promise to try harder next time. But next time rarely came. Then there were the moments that I couldn't explain. One night, I came home to find the kitchen light on. Ethan had been in the living room when I left, and I distinctly remembered turning off all the lights. When I asked him about it, he shrugged. "Maybe you forgot," he said, his tone light. But I knew I hadn't. Another time, I thought I saw his leg twitch while we were watching TV. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, and when I mentioned it, he laughed. "Phantom sensations," he said, brushing it off. "It happens sometimes." I wanted to believe him. I did believe him. What other explanation could there be? Still, the doubts lingered, buried under layers of guilt and love. I told myself I was overthinking, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Ethan had been through so much, and the last thing he needed was me questioning him. So, I pushed the doubts aside and focused on being the wife he needed. But the doubts didn't go away. One evening, during a power outage, I was searching for candles in the kitchen. Ethan was in the living room, or so I thought. When I turned around, I saw him standing by the counter holding a flashlight. My heart stopped. The beam of the flashlight caught his face, and for a split second, he looked as startled as I felt. Then he stumbled, falling back into the chair behind him. My chair slipped," he stammered, his voice shaky. I was trying to reach for the flashlight, and I must have lost my balance. I stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. His explanation didn't make sense, but I didn't press him. I couldn't. The idea that Ethan might be lying, that he might be capable of something so unimaginable, was too much to process. From that moment on, I started seeing things differently. Every movement, every action, every word seemed suspect. I watched him more closely, trying to reconcile the man I loved with the growing doubts in my mind. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my imagination was running wild. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The tipping point came when I ran into our neighbor, Mrs. Greer, a kind woman who had lived in the area for decades. We were chatting about mundane things, weather, garden pests, when she mentioned Ethan in passing. I remember when I first saw him move in, she said with a smile. Such a strong young man, carrying those boxes on his own. I never would have guessed he'd end up in a wheelchair. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I managed to keep the conversation light, but inside, I was spiraling. Ethan had told me he moved into the house shortly before the accident. If he had been walking then, what did that mean? I spent the rest of the day in a haze, replaying every interaction, every conversation we'd ever had. The inconsistencies, the little moments that didn't add up, they all came rushing back with a clarity that made my stomach turn. That night, as I lay in bed beside Ethan, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but I was afraid of what I might uncover. The man I had married, the man I had devoted my life to, suddenly felt like a stranger. I told myself I needed more proof, something concrete before I could accuse him of something so unthinkable. But in my heart, I knew the truth, and it terrified me. The days after my conversation with Mrs. Greer passed in a blur of uncertainty. Every time I looked at Ethan, my mind replayed her words. I found myself studying him in ways I hadn't before, watching for signs, clues, anything that could confirm or disprove the nagging feeling that had taken root in my chest. Ethan, oblivious to the storm inside me, continued as if nothing had changed. He painted in the mornings, leaving the studio door ajar so I could hear the soft swish of his brush strokes, and in the evenings, we'd eat dinner together, chatting about mundane things like the weather or the books I was reading. It all felt so normal, too normal. I tried to push the doubts away, to tell myself I was imagining things, but the harder I tried, the more they consumed me. Every detail of Ethan's behavior began to feel suspicious. Why did he insist on being alone when he painted? Why did he skip so many physical therapy appointments? Why did he always find an excuse when I offered to help him stretch or exercise his legs? The man I had once trusted implicitly now felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something was terribly wrong. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I decided to clean up his studio. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about tidying up. Ethan was notoriously messy, and I'd always been the one to keep things organized. But this time felt different. I wasn't just cleaning. I was searching. I started with a desk, sorting through piles of sketches and paint-streaked paper. Most of it was harmless, unfinished drawings, grocery lists, notes about commissions. But then I found the journal. It was tucked beneath a stack of canvas boards, its leather cover worn and scratched. My hands shook as I opened it, flipping through the pages. The journal wasn't a diary, exactly, but more of a collection of thoughts and observations. Ethan had written about his art, his frustrations, his fears. There were entries about the accident, too, vague mentions of guilt and regret, of feeling trapped and desperate. One passage stood out. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better to let it all fall apart. But I couldn't. I had to do
stared at the
something.
words.
I had
My
my
stomach
stomach
stay.
twisting. Who was he talking about? Was it me? Was it someone else? The journal didn't have dates, so I couldn't be sure when he'd written it, but the implications were clear. Ethan had been hiding something, something big. The next morning, I confronted him. Or at least I tried to. Over breakfast, I brought up the journal, casually mentioning that I'd found it while cleaning the studio. Ethan barely looked up from his plate. "Oh, that old thing," he said with a shrug. "I used to write in it before the accident. It's probably just a bunch of nonsense." But some of it seemed recent. I pressed, my voice trembling. There were things in there about guilt, about making someone stay. Ethan cut me off with a laugh. "Sophia, you know how I get. I'm an artist. I write dramatic things when I'm feeling emotional. Don't read too much into it." He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "I promise, there's nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I was overreacting, that the journal was just a relic of his pre-accident life. But something about his tone didn't sit right with me. He was too dismissive, too casual. It felt like he was trying to shut me down before I could dig any deeper. That day, I started noticing other things. When I came home from work, I found a chair in the kitchen that had been pushed out from the table, something Ethan wouldn't have been able to do from his wheelchair. Another time, I found the TV remote on a shelf that was too high for him to reach. Each little inconsistency chipped away at the foundation of trust one had built with Ethan, leaving me feeling unsteady and unsure. One evening, while I was folding laundry, I overheard Ethan on the phone. He was in a studio, the door slightly ajar, and his voice was low and tense. I couldn't make out everything he said, but the snippets I caught were enough to send a chill down my spine. She doesn't know, he muttered. I've got it under control. Just stick to the plan. I froze, my hands clutching his shirt. Who was he talking to? What plan? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. I waited until the call ended, then knocked on the studio door. Who were you talking to? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan looked up, startled. Just a gallery owner, he said quickly. We're setting up a new exhibit. Why? No reason, I said, forcing a smile. But inside, I knew he was lying. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at Ethan's medical records. As his wife, I had access to the hospital's online portal, and though it felt wrong to snoop, I told myself I had a right to know the truth. Most of the records were what I expected, reports from his initial admission, notes from his physical therapy sessions. But then I found something odd. An MRI scan taken shortly after the accident showed no signs of spinal cord damage. The report described a soft tissue injury and noted that Ethan's symptoms were inconsistent with a complete spinal injury. My breath caught in my throat. Inconsistent. The word echoed in my mind, confirming what I had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Ethan wasn't paralyzed. He had been lying to me all along. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning. The man I had married, the man I had dedicated my life to caring for, had been deceiving me from the very beginning. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but I knew I had to be careful. If Ethan was willing to fake something as monumental as his paralysis, what else was he capable of? And what would he do if he realized I had discovered his secret? For now, I decided to keep quiet. I needed more proof, more answers. But one thing was certain. The life I thought I knew was a lie, and the man I thought I loved was a stranger. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to piece together the full truth about Ethan. His deception had shaken me to my core, but it also ignited something inside me, a drive to uncover the reality of who he was and why he had done this. I couldn't let myself drown in doubt or fear. I needed answers. I started by reaching out to his family. Ethan rarely spoke about them, saying they'd grown distant after his accident. At the time, I didn't push for details, assuming it was a sore subject, but now I wondered if there was more to the story. His younger sister, Claire, was the only relative I had ever met, and even then, it was only briefly at our wedding. She lived a few towns over, and after some hesitation, I decided to call her. Claire sounded surprised to hear from me, but agreed to meet for coffee that afternoon. I could tell she was wary, her tone cautious as we made plans. I didn't tell her what I had discovered. I wasn't ready to reveal how much I knew yet. Instead, I let her think this was just a casual visit. When we met at the cafe, Claire was polite but reserved. She looked like Ethan, sharp cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, but there was a guardedness about her that made me uneasy. After some small talk, I finally worked up the courage to ask about Ethan's accident. Her expression shifted immediately, her polite smile fading into something colder. The accident, she said, her voice flat. What do you want to know? Anything, I said, choosing my words carefully. He doesn't talk about it much, and I feel like there's so much I don't know about what he went through. Claire let out a bitter laugh. What he went through, that's rich. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Let me guess. He's told you he's paralyzed, right? That he's some tragic hero overcoming the odds. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. What are you saying? Claire sat back, crossing her arms. I'm saying Ethan is a liar. He's always been a liar. That accident? It wasn't some random tragedy. He caused it. He was driving drunk and ran a red light. He hit another car, Sophia, a woman and her son. They didn't make it. I felt the blood drain from my face. He never mentioned that. I whispered. Of course he didn't, Claire snapped. He doesn't take responsibility for anything. After the accident, he disappeared for months. Then, out of nowhere, he shows up in a wheelchair, claiming he can't walk. But the thing is, there's no medical proof. My parents tried to help him, but he shut them out. When they started asking questions, he cut ties completely. I stared at her, my mind racing. Why would he fake something like that? Sympathy, attention, avoiding accountability. Take your pick. Claire's voice softened, and for the first time, she looked at me with something like pity. Look, I don't know why he's doing this to you, but you deserve better. You need to be careful. Her words rattled me. I left the cafe feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Ethan's lies went so much deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just about me, it was about his entire life, his entire identity. The man I thought I knew didn't exist. When I got home, Ethan was in his studio, painting as usual. I watched him through the cracked door, studying the way he worked. His movements were fluid, controlled, precise. He didn't look like a man struggling with physical limitations. He looked like someone who had mastered the art of deception. I couldn't stay in the house with him. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly for a while, trying to process everything Claire had told me. Eventually, I ended up at the library, of all places. It was quiet and I needed that. I needed space to think. Sitting at a computer, I searched for news articles about the accident. It didn't take long to find them. The headlines were stark, the details horrifying. A mother and her young son killed in a collision. The driver, Ethan Bell, was suspected of being under the influence, but fled the scene before police arrived. There was a photo of him, taken before the accident. He looked so different, happier, carefree. A man with no trace of the darkness I now knew lurked beneath the surface. The articles didn't mention anything about his paralysis, which confirmed what Claire had said. Ethan's injury was a lie, a way to erase the guilt and responsibility he couldn't face. But what I couldn't understand was why. Why go to such lengths? Why drag me into his web of lies, reading everything I could find? The more I learned, the angrier I became. Ethan hadn't just lied to me. He had manipulated me, used me. I had given up so much for him, sacrificed my time, my energy, my career, all for someone who had built his life on deceit. By the time I got home, it was late. Ethan was in the living room, watching TV, his wheelchair parked neatly beside the couch. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up with that disarming smile I used to love. Now, it only made my stomach turn. Long day, he asked, his tone casual. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just a lot on my mind. Well, sit down. Relax. I made dinner. I wanted to scream, to throw the truth in his face, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I needed a plan. If Ethan was willing to fake his paralysis, what else was he capable of? What would he do if he realized I knew the truth? For now, I had to play along, to keep pretending I was the oblivious, devoted wife he thought I was. But inside, I was already planning my next move. Ethan had built his life on lies, and I was going to tear it all down. The weight of what I had learned sat heavy on my chest, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to function normally around Ethan. I moved through the next few days in a fog, trying to keep my emotions under control while I figured out my next steps. Ethan, oblivious to the storm inside me, continued to play the role of the doting husband, all smiles and small gestures. He would will himself into the kitchen to help me cook or surprise me with one of his paintings. I couldn't help but wonder how much of it was real and how much was just part of his performance. One evening, while Ethan was in the shower, I decided to search his studio again. I had already found the journal, but something told me there was more. Ethan was meticulous about his art supplies, but the room itself was chaotic, with stacks of canvases, paint-streaked rags, and discarded sketches scattered everywhere. I moved carefully, trying not to disturb anything that might tip him off. In one of the drawers of his work table, I found a folder filled with receipts and invoices. Most of them were from art supplies or gallery commissions, but tucked in the back was something different, a series of bank statements from an account I didn't recognize. My name wasn't on it, but Ethan's was, and the amounts listed were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars, all transferred into the account over the past 2 years. My hands shook as I flipped through the statements. I thought about how often Ethan had insisted we couldn't afford certain things, a vacation, a new car, even upgrades to the house to make it more accessible for him. All that time, he had been hoarding money in this secret account. For what? I had no idea, but it was clear now that Ethan's lies extended far beyond his so-called disability. The sound of water shutting off snapped me out of my thoughts. Panicked, I shoved the papers back into the drawer and hurried out of the studio, my heart pounding in my ears. By the time Ethan wheeled into the living room, I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read a book. "You okay?" he asked, toweling off his hair. "You seem distracted lately." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just work stuff." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, as if he were trying to read my mind. I looked away, my grip tightening on the book in my lap. If he suspected anything, he didn't say so, but the tension between us felt heavier than usual that night. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the bank account. I took photos of the statements when Ethan was out of the house and showed them to a friend of mine who worked in finance. She confirmed my worst fears. The account wasn't just for savings. There were payments to private investigators, attorneys, and something labeled as consultation fees, with no clear explanation. It didn't make sense. What could Ethan possibly need a private investigator for? And why had he been paying an attorney when there was no legal trouble that I knew of? That evening, I confronted him, indirectly at least. Over dinner, I casually brought up the topic of money. "Do you ever think about what we'd do if we came into a lot of money?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Ethan glanced up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said with a shrug. "Like if we won the lottery or something. Would you want to travel? Buy a bigger house?" He chuckled, but it sounded forced. "I guess I'd focus on my art. Maybe open a gallery. What about you?" I hesitated, searching his face for any sign of guilt. "I think I'd want to pay off all our debts first. Maybe set up a savings account, something for emergencies." "That's practical," he said, his voice smooth. "But we're fine as we are, aren't we? No need to worry about money." I nodded, but my stomach twisted. His response was too perfect, too rehearsed. He wasn't just lying to me, he was good at it. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head. Ethan wasn't just a man with a secret. He was someone who had built an entire life on deception. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous he seemed. I thought about Claire's warning about the accident and the lives he had destroyed. If he was willing to fake his paralysis and manipulate me into marrying him, what else was he capable of? And how far would he go to protect his lies? The following day, I decided to reach out to someone who might have answers. Ethan had mentioned a therapist once, early in our relationship, a man named Dr. Harland. He had stopped seeing him shortly after the accident, claiming he didn't need therapy anymore, but I remembered the name. After some digging, I found Dr. Harland's office and made an appointment under the guise of seeking counseling for myself. When I arrived, I wasn't sure how to start. Dr. Harland was polite, his demeanor calm and professional, but I could tell he was wary when I brought up Ethan's name. "I'm not sure how much I can share," he said, folding his hands on the desk. Ethan was a patient of mine, but confidentiality. "I'm his wife," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "And I need to understand what's going on. Please." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Ethan was a complicated case," he said carefully. "He struggled with guilt and shame after the accident, but he refused to take responsibility for his actions. He had a tendency to deflect, to create narratives that made him the victim rather than the perpetrator." I swallowed hard. "Did he ever talk about faking his paralysis?" Dr. Harlan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He didn't admit to it outright, but there were inconsistencies in his story. I suspected he was using the wheelchair as a coping mechanism, a way to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. When I pushed him to confront the truth, he stopped coming to sessions. His words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. Ethan had built his entire identity around a lie, and I had been swept up in it, an unwitting pawn in his game. As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. Ethan's lies were unraveling, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to confront him. But I also knew I had to be careful. The man I had married was a stranger, and I couldn't predict what he might do if he realized I was uncovering the truth. For now, all I could do was wait, watch, and prepare for the inevitable showdown. The day after my meeting with Dr. Harland, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. The truth about Ethan was clearer now than ever, but it also felt heavier. Every interaction with him became a minefield, every word laced with the tension of knowing more than I was supposed to. Ethan, as usual, seemed completely unaware of my growing distance. If anything, he was more affectionate, more attentive, as though he could sense my unease but misunderstood its cause. That morning, as we ate breakfast, Ethan slid one of his newest paintings across the table to me. It was a portrait of us, me standing behind his wheelchair, my hand resting on his shoulder. My smile in the painting was radiant, full of joy, but seeing it made my stomach churn. It felt like a mockery of the life he had constructed around his lies. "I wanted to capture how much you mean to me," Ethan said, his voice soft. "You've been my rock, Sophia.
Forced to smile.
I don't know what I'd
My
do without
hands
you."
gripping
Gripping the edge of the table. "It's beautiful," I murmured, though the words tasted bitter. "Thank you." Ethan reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "I've been thinking we should go away for a weekend," he said. "Just the two of us. Somewhere quiet, where we can relax and forget about everything." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The idea of being alone with him, away from the safety of home, filled me with dread. I couldn't afford to let him isolate me, not now. After breakfast, I retreated to the bedroom under the pretense of tidying up, but my mind was racing. I needed a plan. Ethan was becoming more controlling, more possessive, and I couldn't ignore the possibility that he might sense my growing suspicion. I decided to gather everything I had found, his medical records, the bank statements, the notes from my conversation with Dr. Harland, and create a timeline of his lies. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. As I sifted through the evidence, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. It's about Ethan." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who could it be? Was it someone from his past? Someone who knew the truth? After a moment's hesitation, I replied, "Who is this?" The response came quickly. "A friend. Meet me at the park on Elm Street at 3 p.m. I'll explain everything." Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, but curiosity got the better of me. If this person had information about Ethan, I needed to hear it. I didn't tell Ethan where I was going. I simply said I had errands to run and left, my pulse pounding in my ears. The park was quiet when I arrived, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. I spotted a man sitting on a bench near the fountain, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He looked up as I approached, and something about his eyes, sharp, calculating, made me pause. "Are you the one who texted me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, motioning for me to sit. "I'm Michael," he said. "I used to work with Ethan." "Work with him?" I repeated, confused. He told me he was a freelance artist before the accident. Michael smirked, the expression cold and humorless. "Is that what he told you?" Typical. Ethan's good at spinning stories, making himself look like the victim. We worked together at a marketing firm before he got fired. He wasn't paralyzed then, by the way. That came later, after he disappeared for a while. My stomach twisted. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what he's capable of," Michael said, his voice low. "Ethan's a master manipulator. He'll do whatever it takes to get what he wants. And when he doesn't need you anymore," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Why would he fake something like this? Why go to such extremes? Michael shrugged. To escape. To reinvent himself. He's running from something, though I don't know what. All I know is that he's dangerous, Sophia. You need to be careful. The conversation left me shaken. Michael hadn't given me any new information, but his warning echoed the fears I had been trying to suppress. Ethan wasn't just lying to me. He was hiding from something bigger, something that could destroy the life he had built. When I returned home, Ethan was waiting for me in the living room. His expression was calm, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. "Running errands," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Why?" He tilted his head, studying me. "You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" I forced a laugh, brushing past him. "Of course. Just stressed from work." Ethan didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me as I headed to the bedroom. I closed the door behind me, my heart racing. If he suspected I was onto him, I didn't know what he might do. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. I thought about Michael's warning, about the accident, about the lives Ethan had destroyed, and the lies he had told to cover it up. I thought about the bank account, the payments to private investigators and attorneys. What was he planning? And how much longer could I keep pretending I didn't know the truth? As I stared at the ceiling, a chilling thought crept into my mind. Ethan had spent years crafting this facade, and he wouldn't let it crumble without a fight. If he realized I was unraveling his lies, he might do whatever it took to stop me. I turned my head to look at him. He was asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in the dim light. For a moment, I almost believed he was the man I had fallen in love with. But then I remembered the bank statements, the medical records, the journal. This wasn't love. It was control, manipulation, deception. And I couldn't live like this anymore. I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to get out. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days had solidified into something sharper, something that pushed me to act. I couldn't live in this web of lies any longer. I had to find the rest of the truth, even if it shattered what little remained of the life I thought I knew. Ethan was still asleep when I slipped out of bed. His face was serene, peaceful, as though the weight of his deceit didn't touch him in the same way it crushed me. I spent the morning making calls, starting with the private investigator listed in Ethan's bank statements. It took some effort, but I managed to track down his contact information. I called him under the guise of being a potential client, weaving a story about needing help with a personal matter. To my surprise, the investigator was quick to respond, agreeing to meet later that day at a diner just outside town. When I arrived, I found a gruff-looking man with a salt and pepper beard sitting in a booth near the window. He glanced up as I approached, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "You Sophia?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded, leaning back. "So, what's this about? You said it was personal." "It is," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I need to know about Ethan Bell. You've worked with him, haven't you?" His expression darkened. "Bell? Huh? Yeah, I've worked with him." "Why?" "I'm his wife." I admitted, my voice trembling. "And I think he's hiding something. I need to know what you found for him." The man's brow furrowed. "Look, I don't normally share details about my clients, but if you're his wife," he paused, studying me, "you might want to sit tight for this one." He pulled out a file from the briefcase at his side and slid it across the table to me. Inside were pages of documents, photos, and notes. Ethan hired me a couple of years ago to dig up dirt on someone, a woman named Laura Hansen. The name didn't mean anything to me. "Who is she?" "She was the wife of the man Ethan hit in the accident," the investigator explained. "After the crash, she tried to sue him, but he disappeared before the case could go anywhere. A couple of years later, she popped back up, pushing for the case to be reopened. Ethan wanted everything I could find on her background, her weaknesses, anything he could use to discredit her. My stomach turned as I sifted through the documents. Photos of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a weary expression stared back at me. There were notes about her financial struggles, her attempts to get justice for her late husband and son. Ethan hadn't just run from his past. He had actively tried to bury it, to destroy the people who were still suffering because of what he had done. Did he succeed? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The investigator shook his head. Not really. Laura didn't have the resources to keep fighting, but she didn't back down either. As far as I know, she's still trying to find a way to hold him accountable. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes as I closed the file. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling.
He gave me a small
This means
nod,
more to me
his
than
expression
you know. Softening. Be careful, Sophia. A guy like Ethan, he won't take kindly to being exposed. I left the diner feeling raw, my mind spinning with everything I had learned. Ethan wasn't just a liar or a manipulator. He was a coward, someone who would do anything to protect himself, no matter who he hurt in the process. And I had been part of his charade, his shield against the consequences of his actions. The thought made me sick. When I got home, Ethan was in his studio, painting as usual. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He looked so normal, so calm, as though the weight of his lies didn't touch him. But now, I saw him for what he really was, a man who had spent years running from his past, leaving destruction in his wake. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding. Ethan, I said, my voice steady. He looked up, his expression softening into a smile. Hey, you're back. How was your day? I need to talk to you, I said, ignoring his question. About the accident. His smile faltered. What about it? I took a deep breath, clutching the file in my hands. I know everything. About the hit and run. About Laura Hansen. About the lies you've been telling me since the day we met. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then, slowly, he set his paintbrush down and turned his chair to face me. Sophia, he said, his voice calm but cold. You don't understand. Then help me understand. I shot back, my voice rising. Help me understand why you've spent years pretending to be paralyzed, why you lied to me, why you've done everything you can to avoid facing the truth. Ethan's expression darkened, his calm exterior cracking. Because I had no choice, he said, his voice sharp. Do you have any idea what it's like to know you've destroyed someone's life? To know that if the truth comes out, your own life is over? You made that choice, Ethan, I said, my hands shaking. You were the one who got behind the wheel. You were the one who ran. And now you're trying to make me complicit in your lies. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear behind his anger. Sophia, I did it for us. For our life together. I couldn't let my past ruin everything. But it already has, I said, my voice breaking. I can't do this anymore. I can't be part of your lies. Ethan's face hardened, his jaw tightening. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can just walk away from this? From me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. Watch me. I turned and walked out of the studio, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't know what Ethan would do next, but one thing was certain. The man I had married was gone, and there was no turning back. The tension in the house was palpable after my confrontation with Ethan. He didn't say much to me the rest of the day, his silence heavy and loaded with an unspoken warning. I tried to go about my usual routine, but everything felt wrong. My hand shook as I folded laundry, and I jumped at the slightest noise. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I knew Ethan was angry, but I couldn't predict what he might do. I had seen flashes of his temper before, but this was different. This felt dangerous. That night, I locked the bedroom door after Ethan went to sleep in his studio. I couldn't risk being near him, not with everything I had uncovered. The file from the investigator was hidden in my bag, tucked under a pile of clothes. My phone was charging on the nightstand, its volume turned up in case I needed to call for help. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it was shallow and restless, haunted by dreams of Ethan standing over me with that cold, calculating look in his eyes. The next morning, I woke up to find him sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. The sight of him made my stomach churn. His smile was tight, his gaze fixed on me as I entered the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I moved to the counter to pour myself a cup of coffee, aware of his eyes following me the entire time. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, setting his mug down. "I understand why you're upset, but you need to realize something, Sophia. Everything I've done for us." I turned to face him, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "For us," I repeated, my voice trembling. "Ethan, you've lied to me since the day we met. You've built our entire relationship on a foundation of deceit. That's not love. That's control." His expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Control? Is that what you think this is?" He shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed to keep us together." "You haven't sacrificed anything," I shot back, my voice rising. "You've taken my trust, my time, my life. And for what? So you could hide from the truth? So you could keep running?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against the table. "I've given you a life most people would dream of," he said, his voice low and venomous. "A home, stability, purpose. Without me, you'd be nothing." His words cut deep, but they also ignited something inside me, a spark of defiance I hadn't felt in a long time. "You don't get to decide my worth," I said, my voice steady. "And you don't get to control me anymore." The room fell silent, the air between us charged with tension. Ethan stared at me, his eyes cold and calculating, and I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house any longer. It wasn't safe. I needed to leave, but I had to do it carefully. If Ethan suspected I was planning to go, he might try to stop me. I spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal. I cleaned the house, made dinner, and even sat with Ethan while he painted, all the while mapping out my escape plan. I would leave the next morning, early enough that he wouldn't have time to react. I had already packed a bag with essentials, clothes, documents, the file from the investigator. My phone charger and a few other items were tucked inside as well, hidden beneath layers of folded shirts. I planned to go to a friend's house first, someone Ethan didn't know well, and from there, I would figure out my next steps. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if Ethan caught me before I could leave? What if he found the file? What if he followed me? The possibilities were endless, and each one was more terrifying than the last. But I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I had to act. At dawn, I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. I dressed quickly, grabbing my bag from the closet and slinging it over my shoulder. My heart pounded as I crept through the house, every creak of the floorboards making me wince. Ethan's studio door was closed, and I could hear the faint sound of his breathing on the other side. For a moment, I hesitated, fear threatening to root me in place. But then I thought about everything he had done, the lies, the manipulation, the lives he had destroyed, and I forced myself to move. I made it to the front door, my hand on the knob, when I heard his voice behind me. "Going somewhere?" I froze, my blood running cold. Slowly, I turned to see Ethan sitting in his wheelchair at the end of a hallway, his face shrouded in shadow. His expression was unreadable, but there was something menacing in the way he watched me. I began, but he cut me off. "Don't lie to me, Sophia," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm not stupid. I know what you're doing." My heart pounded in my chest, panic clawing at my throat. "Ethan, please," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't do this anymore. I need space. I need." "You need me," he interrupted, wheeling closer. "You think you can just walk out of here and start over? You think the world will be kind to you without me?" My voice firm. "I'd rather face the unknown than stay here and live in your lies." Ethan's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then he stopped, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you leave, you'll regret it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands shook as I turned the knob and stepped out into the cool morning air, the weight of his gaze burning into my back. I didn't stop, didn't look back until I was in my car with the engine running. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. As I drove away, tears streamed down my face, a mix of fear and relief overwhelming me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt free. Ethan's lies no longer bound me, and I was finally taking back control of my life. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. Alone. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the house began to wear off as I drove, leaving me shaking and exhausted. My mind raced with everything that had happened: the confrontation with Ethan, his chilling threats, and the overwhelming fear that I had barely escaped. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. But the road behind me remained empty, and with every passing mile, I felt a small sense of relief. I headed to my friend Rachel's house. She was one of the few people I trusted completely, someone Ethan barely knew. She had always been a voice of reason in my life, and I needed her now more than ever. When I pulled into her driveway, the morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to steady my breathing before I went inside. Rachel answered the door almost immediately, her face a mix of surprise and concern. "Sophia, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stepped inside, my voice trembling as I said, "I need your help. It's Ethan. He's not who I thought he was." She didn't ask any more questions right away. Instead, she guided me to the couch and handed me a glass of water. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice calm but firm. As I recounted everything, the lies, the hit and run, the fake paralysis, the threats, her expression shifted from shock to anger. By the time I finished, her hands were clenched into fists. "That bastard," she muttered. "I always knew there was something off about him, but this— Sophia, you can't go back there." "I'm not going back," I said, my voice steady despite the fear simmering in my chest. "I'm done with him, but I can't just walk away from everything he's done. He's hurt too many people, Rachel. He needs to be held accountable." Rachel nodded, her jaw set. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." We spent the next few hours going through the file I had taken from the investigator, piecing together the timeline of Ethan's lies. It was all there: proof of his involvement in the accident, the payments to discredit Laura Hansen, and the evidence that he had been faking his disability. The weight of it was staggering, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Rachel helped me make a plan. First, we would take the evidence to the police. I was terrified of what might happen, but Rachel reassured me that it was the right thing to do. "Ethan has spent years running from this," she said. "It's time for him to face the consequences." Later that afternoon, we drove to the police station together. My hands were clammy as I clutched the file, my heart pounding with every step. The officer at the front desk listened patiently as I explained my story, her expression growing more serious with each word. When I handed her the file, she flipped through it quickly, her eyes narrowing. "This is serious," she said. "We'll need to open an investigation right away." Her words were both a relief and a new source of anxiety. I knew this was the first step toward justice, but I couldn't shake the fear of what Ethan might do when he found out. Would he come after me? Would he try to hurt me or Rachel? The possibilities were endless, and each one was more terrifying than the last. That evening, Rachel insisted I stay with her. We ordered takeout and tried to distract ourselves with a movie, but my mind kept drifting back to Ethan. I wondered what he was doing, if he had realized I was gone yet. The thought of him sitting in that house, stewing in his anger, sent chills down my spine. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text. I froze, my heart racing as I picked it up. The message was from Ethan. "You think you've won, don't you? But this isn't over, Sophia. You'll regret this." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. Rachel leaned over to read the message, her face darkening. "He's trying to scare you," she said firmly. "Don't let him. We've already taken this to the police. He can't touch you now." But her words did little to ease my fear. Ethan was unpredictable, and I knew he wasn't the type to back down without a fight. The thought of him plotting his next move, of him trying to take back control, was almost too much to bear. The next day, I received a call from the detective assigned to the case. He asked me to come in for a formal statement and to provide any additional evidence I had. Rachel came with me, her presence a comforting anchor as I recounted my story once again. The detective was thorough, asking pointed questions and taking detailed notes. By the time we left, I felt drained but also oddly lighter. The truth was out there now, and it was in the hands of people who could do something about it. Over the next few days, the investigation gained momentum. The police contacted Laura Hansen, who provided her own testimony and evidence about Ethan's attempts to discredit her. They also began looking into his financial records, uncovering even more inconsistencies and evidence of fraud. The walls were closing in on Ethan, and I could only imagine how he was reacting. Meanwhile, Rachel refused to let me out of her sight. She insisted on driving me to work, staying with me at home, and even changing her locks in case Ethan tried to show up unannounced. Her protectiveness was both comforting and a reminder of how precarious my situation still was. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, half expecting another threatening message from Ethan. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, Rachel's phone rang. She answered it, her expression shifting as she listened. When she hung up, she turned to me, her eyes wide. "That was the detective," she said. "They've issued a warrant for Ethan's arrest." Relief and fear washed over me in equal measure. I wanted to believe that this was the beginning of the end, that Ethan's reign of lies and manipulation was finally coming to a close. But I also knew that he wouldn't go quietly. Ethan was a master manipulator, someone who thrived on control. He wouldn't give up without a fight. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had brought me to this point. The love I had once felt for Ethan seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the weight of his betrayal. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had taken the first steps toward reclaiming my life, and no matter what happened next, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. The morning Ethan was arrested, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was at Rachel's house, sipping coffee and staring blankly at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. Local artist arrested for fraud and hit-and-run investigation reopened. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the article. There he was, Ethan, in handcuffs, his face pale and tight with fury as officers escorted him to a squad car. Rachel glanced over my shoulder, reading the headline. "It's over," she said softly, placing a hand on my arm. I wanted to believe her. He can't hurt you anymore. Part of me couldn't shake the fear that this wasn't the end. Ethan wasn't the type to let go easily. He had spent years constructing his lies, manipulating everyone around him. I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, there was a flicker of hope in my chest, a small light in the darkness. The truth was finally coming to light, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The police called me later that day to inform me of Ethan's arrest and to reassure me that I was safe. They explained that Ethan would be held in custody pending further investigation and potential charges. His accounts of fraud, the hidden run, and his years of deception were all unraveling under scrutiny. It was only a matter of time before justice caught up with him. But the aftermath wasn't as simple as I had hoped. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and, surprisingly, guilt. Even though Ethan had hurt me in ways I was still processing, I couldn't completely erase the years we had spent together. There were moments of genuine connection, or at least what I thought was genuine, that lingered in my mind like ghosts. I hated him for what he had done, but I also mourned the life I thought we had built. Rachel helped me navigate the chaos, her unwavering support a lifeline I desperately needed. Together, we packed up my things from the house I had shared with Ethan. Walking through those rooms was surreal. each one filled with memories that now felt tainted. The studio was the hardest to face. His unfinished paintings still sat on the easels, the smell of turpentine and paint thick in the air. I hesitated at the doorway, my chest tightening. "You don't have to go in there," Rachel said gently, her hand on my shoulder. But I shook my head. "I need to," I said, stepping inside. I spent hours going through his things, sorting through the remnants of a life built on lies. There were moments when I wanted to smash everything, to burn it all, and let the ashes carry away the pain. But I didn't. Instead, I packed up his belongings methodically, as if putting away the pieces of him would help me move on. By the time I was done, the studio felt hollow, empty. It was no longer his space. It was just a room. When we left the house for the final time, I didn't look back. The weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, a space that felt entirely my own. It was quiet and modest, but it was mine. I started going to therapy, working through the trauma of my relationship with Ethan and the tangled emotions it had left behind. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything threatened to pull me under, but I kept moving forward, one step at a time. Laura Hansen reached out to me not long after Ethan's arrest. She had seen the news and wanted to thank me for coming forward. We met for coffee at a little cafe downtown, and as she shared her story, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for her strength. She had spent years fighting for justice, never giving up even when the odds seemed impossible. "You gave me the courage to keep going," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "Because of you, he won't hurt anyone else." Her words stayed with me long after our meeting. For so long, I had felt powerless, trapped in Ethan's web of lies. But now I realized that by standing up to him, I had reclaimed not only my life, but also the lives of those he had wronged. It was a small victory, but it was enough. One afternoon, as I was unpacking a box of old photos, I came across one from the early days of my relationship with Ethan. We were at a park, laughing, the sunlight casting a golden glow over us. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the man in the picture with the one who had lied to me for years. It was a painful reminder of how easily deception can disguise itself as love. But I didn't throw the photo away. Instead, I tucked it into a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder of what I had survived, of the strength I had found within myself. I wasn't the same person I had been when I met Ethan, and I never would be again. But that was okay. I was stronger now, wiser. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The trial came and went, a final chapter in the long saga of Ethan's deception. He was found guilty on multiple charges: fraud, obstruction of justice, and his role in the hit and run. Seeing him in court was surreal, a mix of vindication and sorrow. He didn't look at me once, his face hard and unyielding. When the verdict was read, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Justice had been served, and though it couldn't erase the pain he had caused, it brought a sense of closure. Life after Ethan wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. It became a way to process my emotions, to channel the chaos inside me into something tangible. My first piece was a self-portrait, raw and unpolished but honest. It wasn't about perfection. It was about healing. As I hung the painting on the wall of my apartment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The shadows of my past were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had found my way out of the darkness, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole, and that was enough.